Okay.
Thank you, Cliff.
You're welcome. And you're live.
Not Memorex? Kelly, you're the only other one that
I got it. I got it.
Cliff, both panelists, both Megan and Robert can be promoted to panelists. Robert's a member of the committee as well.
Did Megan come to one of our prior meetings?
No.
No, but Jerry and I met with Megan, I want to say maybe the beginning of the year, to talk about the Army Corps project. I think after, you know, we found out that we were not in the budget.
I've heard her name. Maybe it was bandied about at some point. I don't know, or discussed, but I remember hearing her name.
Yeah.
We may have reported that.
Kelly may have mentioned.
I see her. I see her. She's here.
Hey everyone, thanks for having me tonight. I'm excited to work with you on this.
Megan, thank you for coming.
Finding us.
Yes, of course, of course. It's great you could do these meetings, you know, even with COVID and everything online, so
Yeah.
lucky for that.
We also find they go much faster.
Promise?
Well, we have to be up at 9 o'clock.
Okay,
So we have a quorum now.
we do.
So shall we get started?
That'd be great.
Okay. Call this meeting to order at 7:31. Let's go through old business first, and we do have to approve the minutes of our last meeting. So maybe we should do that first.
Let me ask, Megan, are you in a hurry? Do you need to go? Should we get an update from you first?
I am in no hurry at all. So you,
Sorry.
You want to be entertained by us, Megan?
what'd you say?
You want to be entertained by us for this evening?
Yes, absolutely. I'm in for the ride.
Cool. Okay. So everyone read the minutes?
Yes.
All in favor? Any changes first? All in favor?
Aye.
Okay. Dana, since you're a picture, we don't know what you're doing.
I know. Sorry. My video isn't really working, but
That's okay. Are you okay with the minutes?
yes, the minutes are fine.
Okay. Okay, then let's get going. Dan, old business. This is back from our July meeting. First order of business is you were going to get a dollar total for the storm losses and flooding in 7, 11, and 12. Were you able to get that?
Not yet. And we had, we kind of got sidetracked getting our losses from Isaias in August and September. So that was a very costly storm for us.
It was? Oh, from the power?
Over $500,000.
From the power being?
No, just in terms of our response. And obviously the power outages impacted us greatly.
Okay. Second point, County Executive Latimer suggested the Village of Mamaroneck send a letter to himself and to County Legislature, Catherine Parker, requesting a commitment from the county to commit to the Army Corps portion, the county's portion of the Army Corps project, should it ever come alive again. Was that done?
No, I think we submitted a letter in the past. I can dig it up and.
You'd asked for a new one, a
Yeah.
recommitment to, or a re-request?
Yeah, I can find that and gussy it up and revise it.
Okay, when you send that, is it easier just to send us copies of it?
Well, what I'll do is I'll put a draft together and maybe I'll share it with you, Peggy, just to make sure it.
Okay.
As the chair of the committee.
Perfect. Is everyone okay with that?
Yes.
Okay. Number 3, where are we on the Anita Lane Bridge?
They've started the work, actually.
They did?
Yeah, they were, they've been, over the last week, they were preparing moving the water from the area where they're going to install the new wing wall. So
Could you please find out when they're taking the wing wall down? I want to watch it go down.
I
This
don't
is-
know, but
This
I
is
know that
13 years worth of work.
yeah, no, I got a call from a resident who was having complaining about the contractors making too much noise. So I know they are doing the work. I actually spoke or had a email back and forth with the county yesterday and today on getting an update. So basically, they're in the process of building the area so they can remove the wing wall.
If you find out when the wing wall is coming down, please call me.
Okay.
I need to video it. I need to actually see that it's happening. Because that's really our first major flood project in the village after 13 years.
You and
Maybe talking-
you and Manfred from Manfred's Kitchens can sit down on his back deck and.
Oh my God, just let me know separately, please. Okay, any further update on the Washingtonville community's request to remove the Waverly Avenue Bridge?
You know, we had a meeting where they gave a presentation to the village board. Was that in July, Kelly, or was it August? I can't remember.
It was August.
August. So one of the commitments that the town and their engineers made was to look at some additional traffic analyses, specifically as to how the detour would look going down Point Avenue with a potential temporary traffic light. I know Andrew is actually one of the attendees, and I think he met with technically the town's engineer either late last month or early this month. I think they're trying to maximize and make sure that signal works to the best extent practicable. You know, at this point, there's been no decision or recommendation to do anything other than the replacement of the bridge. In terms of pedestrian traffic, it's going to have sidewalks on both sides of the bridge. You know, it will be, as pedestrian friendly as it can be made. That was one of the suggestions.
Is there enough room on that bridge?
Yeah, absolutely.
Wow.
Well, it might be a little wider than it is now, but the actual width of this driving surface isn't changing. But we're going to, put another sidewalk on, so there's sidewalks on both sides, and have it connect to a river walk as well.
Okay. Has anything been done by Save the Sound to test the water on the downriver side of the road to nowhere?
I asked Peter Linderoth from Save the Sound a couple months ago. I have not followed up with him. I will do that tomorrow.
All right, my frustration is we've been asking for this for almost a year and it just keeps getting moved from month to month.
Yeah, I don't know to what extent they were able to do a quality water monitoring program this year with social distancing, but I'll check.
Okay. Okay. 1602 Ellis, we want to have a discussion. One of my neighbors may be joining us for that whole discussion if he doesn't jump in the next few minutes. But so 1602 Ellis, for the members of the committee may remember, may not remember, was pending building department approval based on all kinds of testing and requirements to be met. And I will say, from what I've been told today by my neighbor, 9 old trees were pulled out. I don't know if they had permits to pull them out. They pulled them out with a backhoe and just tore them out of the ground. I thought we were passing a new tree ordinance. Didn't that get passed?
That's just up for public hearing, Peggy. It hasn't even gone through public hearing. I mean, I think one easier solution to all of this would be, but this is going to have to be, would be if we just require, a tear down or new development on a lot, even if it's a single family home, that it go to the planning board for site plan review. That could cover the tree issue and it would just be handled easily. But that's my thought on it.
I can understand them clearing trees in the center of the property where they're going to be building. From what I understood, they took out trees on the perimeter where there was not the riverside, the other side, the rear of the property. And I don't know, are developers allowed to willy-nilly tear down trees?
I believe they are at this point.
I mean, that's one of the public policy initiatives that the board's trying to address with the tree law.
Well, but it's further, you're tearing down trees in a flood zone. And as we all know, trees that suck up water are important things in flood zones. So here we have a property which is being built in a flood zone. Their residents have some concerns about that, as we've been sharing. And now further, we're tearing, it should be more restrictive about what you can do in a flood zone, not less restrictive, based on what trees do by nature, I think. Does anybody else have a feeling on the committee?
Hello, hello.
Sorry?
Oh, Mr. Ryan is just saying hello.
Oh, hello, Paul.
How you doing?
All's well. How are you?
Okay, I've been listening, but I couldn't get in on my computer, so I'm on the iPad. But I'm here. I agree with what you say about trees in a flood zone.
I think it's something we should be considering. I don't know if that's independent of this tree law or if it becomes a section in the tree law.
I would suggest that members of the flood committee appear at the public hearing on this law and voice those opinions.
When that's going to be, Kelly?
Dan, it's starting Monday, right? Doesn't the tree law hearings? I'm sorry, Tuesday the 29th. Monday's the holiday.
Okay. Okay. I'll jump because Robert Ingenito has joined us, and we'll come back to 1602 Ellis afterwards. And I think one of the questions we had was how we as a group can try and work with you, Robert, to get information to the community regarding flooding issues, flooding emergencies. How can you see us interfacing with you?
Well, first, let me say hello, everyone. It's nice to be here. Sorry you don't get to see my face. The computer that I got from Cliff in the village doesn't have a video on it, so I can only do audio. Just to give you a little background, Jerry Barbario, the village manager, hired me on a part-time basis back in January to do mostly communications for the village, putting out press releases, helping the various departments and citizen committees with stories or getting the word out about various initiatives. And, you know, kind of trying to tighten things up on the village website and maybe even do a redesign and do kind of like a weekly email blast to residents who sign up for to receive emails. So I started this off in January, and then come late February, early March, as you all know, we got hit with COVID, and kind of everything that I was doing had to be put on hold to just address the COVID situation that we were in. And, you know, that kind of continued for about 2 to 3 months. And then things have kind of quieted a bit. So I'm trying to do my best to get back into helping out committees and departments and getting the word out about various things. Am I able to share my screen with people? Let me see. Oh, here we go. So here, for example, can you all see this?
Yes. Yep.
Yes.
This is the Flood Mitigation Advisory Committee webpage. And, you know, here's kind of like, this is your hub. And I want to try to help Peggy and the whole committee try to, you know, give some meat and bones to this, to show, you know, give people an idea about, you know, what it is as this committee does. I heard this really great thing about this bridge, is it Anita Lane
Anita
Bridge?
Lane, yes.
Yeah, and that kind of just triggered a little bell in my head to say, oh, that seems like a really neat story to kind of push out there and say, you know, this is something that the Flood Mitigation Advisory Committee has been doing and working on for, what did you say, Peggy, a couple of years?
13 years?
Yeah, and you know, that's a great accomplishment. So, you know, if I can try to like put together a little blurb or a couple of
Okay.
sentences about that.
If you want at some point you and I to have just a sidebar conversation, I can sort of walk you through
Yeah.
the history of it.
Yeah. One thing that, and you know, stories like that are always great to highlight in the community. Recently, I worked with Shannon Purdy in the Traffic Commission, and we put together, you know, this copy about exactly what the Traffic Commission does and the direction that they're heading in, some of the initiatives that they're doing with the Vision Zero network, and just to kind of, again, give people like an idea, not in like big, copious, you know, lengthy, you know, material about what it is that everybody does, but kind of try to tailor it down into the, what I like to call, you know, the elevator pitch of what all the various committees and commissions do. That way, for folks who are interested in volunteering and becoming involved in the village, we want to be sure that they have all the information that they need to make some informed decisions. We have a nice little kitty visiting us. Similarly, and this kind of goes along the lines of what we were talking about with the Anita Lane Bridge, this was something that I worked with the tree committee on for the village's Facebook page. Just, hey, you know, here are some great trees that we are planting in our community that we're maintaining and keeping up. And, you know, talk about the trees, talk about the tree committee, and, you know, leave it at that. And hopefully it gets people interested in saying, oh, this is something that'll be of interest to me. I'd like to get involved with it. One of the other, you know, I talked about the weekly emails that I do. This is one that I'm also particularly proud of in here, is the fact that the village broke its census participation rate from 20 years. We actually bested the response rate from the 2000 census. So, you know, this was a little press release story that I put together. Jason Pinto, who's in the Parks and Rec department, he helped me get this picture and this nice little thermometer poster that we have at Harbor Island Park. And again, you know, these are just kind of like nice little stories that I think people in the community appreciate and, you know, get to know what's going on. And then usually every Friday, it just so happened, I've been dealing with a family emergency, but so this email blast went out on Monday. But on a weekly basis, I send out these emails to folks who sign up of, you know, all of the different meetings that are happening in the village. Here are some of the stories that we're doing, any sort of announcements. Here's something from the Parks and Recreation Department. They're working with the Community Resource Center on a survey about Columbus Park. The Arts Council, they've got this community mass quilt project that they're working on. So, you know, again, I love to work with Peggy, with folks in the community to think about, like, in a given year, you know, what are kind of the highlighted stories or highlighted events that we want people in the community to be aware of, that can, you know, just be a point to engage with the Mitigation Advisory Committee and think about, you know, where those stories are, how can we schedule them out, so that they can, have their time to shine in the sun. And
it's a little more challenging in times, as I'm sure everything is in times of COVID, but normally one of the things that we would have done is a river cleanup.
yeah,
That certainly you could help get the word out about.
I think there are still, I know that the Marine Education Center,
She does them weekly.
yeah, she's been doing those cleanups in Harbor Island Park weekly.
Right.
It definitely can be done.
Well, I think because of the way we used to do them, I mean, one year Paul and Paul's wife and I dug out a car along a riverbank, literally, car parts. So you're kind of in contact with people. I think at this point it's probably a little more challenging.
Yeah.
One thing, Robert, that the flood committee has talked about for a while is, putting up some hurricane season emergency preparation material. So that's something that we could do annually and, update it every year.
Yeah.
Talk about getting together a go bag and what should be in it and what's your evacuation plan.
Right.
Yeah, I think we have a page on the site about with the Red Cross.
And what to do in case of emergency and flooding.
Yeah. So we can
Yeah,
probably.
and it's always a good idea to look at those things and see, well, what can we do to refresh that, make it a little bit more interesting for the new year.
How many people do you have on your email list?
It's somewhere, the number is changing, but I think somewhere around like 2,000 or
So it can't hurt
2,200.
to blast it out once a year.
Yeah.
Feature it once a year.
And then it's again another point, touch point to say, here's this thing that the flood committee has put together. For more information about what they do, go to this webpage. Talk with the members.
But you wouldn't be the right place. I guess, Dan, everything comes through you in Jerry's office in terms of if there's a storm coming. All that communication goes.
Oh yeah, in terms of getting messages out to the public, yeah. Robert's a big part of that because Robert is the one who administers and sets up all of our reverse 911 calls. So
I actually did mean to mention to you after the last two storms where your weather service said we were going to get 6 inches of rain, and Weather Underground and NOAA kept saying 1 to 3. I think we should think about changing our weather service because they've been really off the last 2 storms, big time. And you said we're paying for that, right?
It is a subscription service.
Yeah, maybe we should look at that. I'm not sure how accurate they are.
Dan had alluded to the fact that I write these, or I help administer those announcements that go out. That's in the world of what the technology is called. It's a reverse 911.
Yes.
So you record a message, you send it through the system. People, again, who sign up for the system are able to get this recorded message or a text message delivered to them. I want to point out, in my previous job, I used to be the communications director for a small private school. And part of my job was actually recording and sending out the snow day messages whenever the kids were off from school, which undeniably made me the most popular person at the school.
Yeah, well, the flood guy's not going to be so popular here.
Flood guy's not going to be so popular. Yeah, if when it comes to those announcements about a hurricane or some sort of tropical storm or something that's coming up, if there is some materials that we have about hurricane preparedness, then that's a great opportunity to kind of remind folks about, go to this webpage to see what should be in your toolkit.
Not to put any undue pressure on you, but September is National Preparedness Month.
Yeah.
Dan?
Yes, Paul.
Yeah, do we have it set up with the Hispanic Resource Center to run emails or voicemail messages through them to their members? Remember, they were kind of sensitive about that.
It was going to go to Durandi and then she was going to blast it
Yeah, I
out.
think you're right.
Yeah, or
Yeah,
whatever.
like I said, the last one was Isa Ias. But I don't think that there was a lot of, there wasn't much information we had to communicate to the public other than, the power's still out and we don't know when it's going back on. I think that Durandi probably is getting these items, but I can make sure that, that process is more, make sure it's adhered to and all that fun.
Yeah, probably really doesn't work. We've got to have some system. Maybe Robert can work on it with them to make sure that the people in Washingtonville get notified.
Yeah, I mean unfortunately with our reverse 911 system, it doesn't do an automatic. We can't just do a call that gets translated.
No, but but on emails, Durandi can certainly
Yeah.
blast them out to her sphere of influence.
Yeah.
And we've honestly been talking about that for quite a long time.
I think if I can just pipe in here, the onus of these reverse 911 call systems is, in order to be on it, you have to be the person to sign up for it. We can't, there are certain privacy rules and regulations, like we can't just automatically appropriate people's lists
We know that.
to send a message out.
But because not everyone will give you their email address, the suggestion, Robert, was to send everything through Durandi, and she could then alert her.
She's definitely on all of my lists, and she's getting all of those things.
Are your lists the same as Dan and Jerry's lists?
Yes.
Okay.
The thing is, like, once it's out of once the message has been sent, I can't do much more to beyond that.
No, then it's up to her.
Right.
Okay.
But we can't ask for feedback. Did you get it out? Well, was there any reception? What did the people think of the message? Did you get any feedback?
Always a very good, yeah. I mean, with every message that goes out, there's always a good idea to get people's feedback on how well it was received.
Hey, Robert, I'm sorry. Robert, do we ever send the messages, make them available in Spanish language?
A few we've done. I've worked with Durandi on trying to get some messages translated into Spanish. And there have been some occasions where I have sent something, I can't think of what they were off the top of my head, but I've sent some stuff out that they've kind of taken and made it into their own and translated it themselves.
Okay.
But I think like there were some things at the beginning of COVID where I sent something, or I put together something, it might've been about sanitation pickup. And I reached out to her specifically and said, can we get this translated into Spanish? Because I know it's a pretty important public health thing.
Thank you.
So, I'm sorry, there's no way to, on those reverse 911s to hear this message in English, press 1, to hear it in Spanish, press 2?
It would mean that somebody has to actually record it in Spanish. It's not that this is something that can be automatically done.
Right.
Is there a Spanish speaker on the staff that can do that?
The problem, one of the issues is, though, we'd have to have a separate contact list
Yeah,
for
that's
people
the
who only
problem.
receive the call in Spanish, because basically it's it's basically a spreadsheet with several thousand names and phone numbers on it. It's
Right.
you need to create a separate list.
And you have people who won't give you their phone number.
And as Robert mentioned, you have to subscribe to the system in that
Yeah,
case.
it's complicated.
It gets a little complicated.
Yeah. Okay. Megan, I was curious, and this is kind of on the side, but is there any information from Senator Schumer's office regarding the Army Corps project that you can share with us that you know of, other than we're on, it seemed, we were told we're on a hold?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's why I wanted to join tonight is that, so back in April, and please someone stop me at any time, you know, if I'm just repeating things you already know. But we received word in April that the Army Corps and the Army Office of Civil Works, which is basically the Army Corps' boss, cleared the pre-construction and engineering and design efforts. You know, although we didn't get funding this year for the actual new construction phase, Civil Works said that it would support the Army Corps starting the pre-construction engineering and design to pursue them and to pursue the remaining funding in FY21. You know, obviously a lot quickly happened at the beginning of this year, but I just wanted to see, you know, the Army Corps told us that they were going to reach out to New York State DEC in April because as the project sponsor, DEC needed to fund some of that pre-construction and engineering design effort. So I just wanted to see, you know, what the actual pre-construction and engineering design efforts are now, right now, as it stands.
We don't know, do we, Dan?
Well, I think and maybe this is not the same exact thing, but you know, when I think I had spoken with the Corps last year, I think I told the committee that there was about a couple $100,000 left.
Money left over.
And they were gonna,
Right.
pre-engineered design, they were gonna try and start designing one of the elements of the project.
Right.
And what my recollection was that element was gonna be the replacement of the Ward Avenue Bridge.
That sounds familiar.
Yeah, I don't know if that's what wound up happening, but that's what I recall from our discussions with the Corps.
Great. Yeah, that's helpful to know because, you know, the Army Corps did indicate to us in April that they were ready to start some of that design phase, but they needed something from the New York State DEC to begin as a funding sponsor. So I think it'd be good, you know, if you all in the village checked in with the DEC possibly, and I could check back in with the Army Corps, because although we didn't get the construction funding that we all really want, and, you know, the senator believes is unfair, you know, I think that's important to be monitoring too, this pre-construction and engineering design, because the Army Corps did indicate to us in April that this parts of this project could be done now.
Who's our contact now at the Army Corps? Who's running the project?
I can't recall her name right now.
It's not Matt. It's
Yeah.
under Matt.
Mingia. I know she's actually a
Is that
village.
somebody who lived fairly locally?
Yeah, no, she lives up in Harbor Heights. I can't remember her name. Janine. Oh God, she's gonna watch this movie and hate watch this.
Sorry, Janine. It's just been so long.
Mingio.
Sorry?
I think it's Janine Mingio is her name. That's
Okay.
I got it right because I don't want to.
So we're still sort of on the radar?
In terms of
The project potentially happening?
I would defer to Megan on the machinations at the federal level.
So, so I received indication from the Army Corps, you know, and I'll circle back with them too, that some of this construction and design work could still be done right now. Of course, we still need to hit the ultimate goalpost here, which is getting construction fully funded, you know, but some of that work, it appears to me that some of that pre-construction and design work can begin as long as there's the proper cost sharing in place. You know, of course, the state has been very hit by this pandemic, but I think that's something that's definitely worth you all looking into from a pre-construction and design standpoint, while we still, you know, think of solutions here for the actual construction of this project. As you know, focusing on the next steps right now, it seems that the Army Corps and Civil Works support the project, whereas this Office of Management Budget formula that they use is really the holdup. And I'm sure you've all seen that letter, and I can provide it, you know, if you haven't, that this formula just didn't account for this loss of human life, this great loss of human life. And I'm so sorry that you all had to witness firsthand in Mamaroneck. But, that we have a few options for getting the actual construction funding going. But I think, separately, pre-construction, something you should absolutely, as this committee, be monitoring and seeing, what pre-construction options there are right now. Because as Dan was saying, there was some talk of funding being there for that if the right cost sharing was there.
Dan, do we have the name of someone at the DEC that is a contact on this project in particular?
Well, the state contact is someone named Al Fuchs.
Okay.
There are other folks at DEC that are involved with it. I can go through some of the notes.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Megan, this is the best news I've heard in months on this.
Yeah,
project.
I'm shocked because we really were under the impression this was
Dead?
dead in the water. Yeah.
Yeah, and I know it was very, very disheartening, to see the actual new start construction, because of that, what we think is very bureaucratic formula, for the benefit cost ratio that it doesn't seem to account, at least for the loss of human life.
Right.
You would think that this project would be top of the pile, and that's what the senator thinks too. But for the pre-construction and design, it seems that can still move forward, but the actual new starts construction is like what our fight has to be right now. So there might be a few options. So first, of course, we can convince the Office of Budget that the loss of life has to override, their low benefit cost analysis, which is kind of what, the senator, along with Senator Gillibrand and Congressman Engel pushed for in that letter that I just referenced. We could wait for supplemental appropriations funding or an emergency declaration. But again, we don't want to see another emergency have to happen like this to get this funded. So, that's not, at least in my mind, the top way to do this. And then the last thing is that we were looking at, and this is what I mentioned to Kelly a few weeks ago, is that in the next COVID infrastructure package, maybe there would be a way to allocate some additional funding to the Army Corps. I've talked to my team about this, and to be candid, there's a lot of uncertainty in Washington right now as to taking up any emergency stimulus or infrastructure bill in the near future, and the senator's fighting hard for that too, especially for the state and local aid that I know, Mamaroneck and New York State must need desperately. But, maybe this project we had some talks about could be viewed as a candidate, given the design can, happen relatively quickly, it seems, and go to construction if it's funded. But yeah, I just want to make sure with the pre-construction and design stuff, if there's funding, we're identifying those cost sharing options here.
And if there's anything you need from us, please let us know.
Yeah, I'll reach out.
We had no idea that this even happened in April.
Right. Hey, Megan, I just want to add too, I know that letter was written by Senators Schumer and Gillibrand and also Elliot Engel. And as you know, we're losing Elliot Engel, but Peggy has already reached out to Jamal Bowman, and he has been very receptive to her. I think you missed that at the beginning of our meeting. And so she's bringing him up to speed.
Yeah, I actually, George Latimer had recommended reaching out to him, which I did. And I couldn't believe it. Within 10 minutes, he responded back. And we set up a call, and sometime in October, he wants to come up here and see what all the fuss is about. And he said he's very interested in getting this through.
Absolutely. And we're looking forward to partnering with him on that, as we continue this, because unfortunately, this has been a years-long endeavor. We want to keep pushing for this, especially in the coming months. So hopefully, everybody sounds like Jamal is very excited to get this going too. And we're excited to partner with him on this. So, and I'm glad that I'm here with the committee, it's just really helpful when everyone's on the same team pushing for the same thing.
Thank you. And it's part of this 13-year we've been at it. So whatever we can do to help, we're certainly here to help. And I know the village is too.
Absolutely. So for an action item, I'll come back to Army Corps tomorrow and ask, if there's been any updates, and if, the village could just reach out and see, where the project stands from the local, standpoint with pre-construction and design. And I'll do the same on my end.
Thank you. And if you need anything from the committee, just let us know. And ditto, Dan, if there's anything we can do to help you.
Cool.
Cool. That's good
That's
news. Okay, should we go on back to Ellis Place?
Yeah. Oh, Robert had a question.
Sorry,
Does Robert have a question? No, I think it's.
Robert has a cat.
I'm just, Peggy, I'm going to sign off. If there's anything else
Thank you.
from me, but you and I, we can, I'm already starting to put together some things that I want to touch base with you on. So
Okay, and we can loop in some of the committee people if they're interested to try and help too.
great.
Hey, Robert, I can also give you some, it was just coincidental, I just got it today, but some history of the committee, when it was formed, what it was formed to do. So I can send that your way.
That'll be
Paul
great.
and I are still here.
Yeah.
Founding members.
Very good. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Robert. Thanks.
Thank you, Robert.
Have a good
Here's
evening.
another part of the discussion that I think we should be having is what we can do as a committee. And 1602 Ellis seems to highlight this to me. While I know we're not a land use committee and we don't have a lot of teeth, I still think somehow any construction in the village that, and Kelly, steer me if I'm going off the rails here, but any new projects in the village, shouldn't the flood committee be somewhat engaged in?
Well, here I'll just give the committee some background, because Peggy and I talked about this a couple weeks ago, and there's this sense of frustration, I believe, that there's a lot of construction that goes on that seems to be against flooding regulations or best practices, and that maybe the flood committee should make its voices heard on these things as they're happening. So, if the flood committee wants to discuss construction projects that are of concern, that are in flood zones, I think it would be fine if they do. And if you want to then, as a group, just as you could individually, write a letter, send it in to the building department, the planner, the village manager, to Dan, just to bring the concerns of flood committee or flood committee members about flooding impacts to the attention of the village. It's not a formal thing. It's just a, something you can do rather than be just frustrated over it, and feel like there's nothing you can do. Robert, are you waving hello or goodbye?
No, I'm waving. I'd like to say something when it's appropriate.
Go ahead.
Okay, I have several things. One, I was very happy to hear Mr. Engineer talk about adding information to the website. I think that's long overdue, and I think that's great. He said he has 1,000 people on his blog that he communicates with. There are 20,000 people in the village. We need to find a way to communicate with as many people as we can and let them know about information available on the website for a flood committee and all other things. Secondly, since the Army Corps project is possibly now still in play, I didn't hear whether the letter went out to George, getting the confirmation that the county, okay, so I think it's important that we get that letter out, because the purpose of that was to send to the state, so to make sure that they still have their money. If that's going to come up soon, I think it's important that we get that out. Third, I think we should ask Joanne, we may have spoken with her before, talked about it, about asking her, since we want to make sure that the Hispanic community gets all relevant and important information, to see if there's someone in her community that she thinks would be appropriate to be on the committee with us, and they can be the liaison between us and that community.
We've asked that repeatedly, and no one's come forth.
Yeah, we've
Okay.
asked Randy.
Okay,
We
the other
have
thing
asked that.
is, Kelly was kind enough to send this form from 2007. And the purpose of the committee back then is one sentence long. I'd like to read it because I think we should all hear it. And then, based on what Kelly was saying, should we revise or amend the purpose of the committee and extend it beyond what we're doing, or are there other things we should be doing? So is it okay if I read the one sentence purpose?
Sure.
Assisting the Village of Amerenik in identifying potential solutions to flooding, educating residents on flooding and safeguards, searching for grants, as well as hosting public meetings on flooding and flood mitigations. I don't know that we've done much or if there's anything to do as far as grants. And as far as public meetings and getting information out, we certainly haven't done as much as we can or should in that area either.
And so,
Okay. Go ahead,
just
Dan.
one thing on grants, we just got the announcement from the state about the, it used to be called pre-disaster mitigation. They changed the acronym to BRIC, B-R-I-C, I can't remember off the top of my head. And the flood mitigation action grant is, they're accepting.
B-R-I-C-K? What did you say?
BRIC. I think it's building resilience.
You said it's free.
What?
I'm sorry.
It's basically hazard mitigation money that the state is now accepting letters of intent for us to look at submit grant proposals. So I reviewed that with our grant writer today. We're looking at our hazard mitigation program and various things that are in there that we could look at applying for. She asked about acquiring properties in the flood zone, and I mentioned, and Peggy knows the big issue, which is our even
Real estate's a little too expensive.
yeah, it's a house in Amerenik which costs $450,000, and I hate to pick on the Binghamton, New York area, but the same house in Binghamton is $80,000.
Yeah.
It's so hard for us to make the benefit cost analysis to get.
Dan, what was it, like 7 or 8 people applied for those grants when I applied for the grant to raise the house, and
Yeah,
they
and
were all turned down.
And you got half of what you really needed. So,
Okay.
yeah,
But they were all flat out turned down
Yeah.
because
this can make the cost benefit.
yeah,
Not even close.
properties have only gotten more expensive since 2011, 12.
Not even close to meeting the cost benefit ratio.
Right. Right.
So, but we're looking at it. We might submit 1 or 2 letters of intent. We're possibly looking at one to initiate a plan for acquiring open space in the flood plans, because one of the projects was about that long-term river walk and any open areas.
You're a little late on 1602 Ellis because that should have been acquired.
But and then possibly the long-term planning for the seawall.
Is there any money, Dan, available for people to raise their homes still?
It didn't. There was nothing in there about acquisitions or elevations.
Okay.
Just, it was really acquisition of open space.
Okay.
Not acquisition to tear down and.
Got it.
Yeah. So, but I'll be working on that over the next week or so.
Okay.
So that's a grant program that just did come out.
Robert, I have to say the committee was technically, I guess, Paul, dissolved and reformed by Kathy Sabalt in 2008.
Okay.
Yeah.
So there may be a very different mission statement.
There is not. There is not. What I sent you today is all we have.
I thought there was another mission statement written at that time, Paul, wasn't there?
I don't recall.
Okay. So regardless, we can certainly work on putting that together or reformulating it.
No, we could change the mission statement or ask the board to.
Do you want to take a swing at that, Robert, and see what you come up with? And then we can all discuss it?
Okay.
I think one of our problems is that people are only interested in flooding issues when it's raining like hell. You know, if it isn't, it's hard to get, you know, their attention and get them going on something. Is Ellis in the floodplain?
It's in the floodway as well as the flood zone, yes.
Well, if
Yeah.
it's in the floodway, it should, I mean, that's ammunition to get something in the, you know, tree committee or wherever to make them deal with it.
Well, let me update you. So my neighbors and I sent a letter to the board and the building department in December, I think, last year. And Jerry and Dan answered it on January the 10th. And I still have questions based on that. But basically what we were told was the building department file will be available for public review and specific documents can be requested through FOIL.
Yeah.
What we'd requested was answers to our questions and to be highlighted as things progressed. That didn't happen. And my neighbor was calling on a monthly basis to the building department to see what upgrades were, what the process was, and was told nothing to tell you, nothing to tell you, nothing to tell you. And yesterday the backhoe showed up on the property. He called the building department and they said, yes, permits were issued.
Yeah, I did send you and the committee back in July 29th an email, you know, letting you know what I had spoken, what I said to our consulting engineer prior about 1606 Ellis, which was basically that the project was coming up for review. I sent him the memo that I had sent out to you back in January. So I mean, I wouldn't characterize that we weren't keeping, you know, people up to date about this. I mean, I certainly followed up with you.
Nobody kept us up to date when this was being passed. We still have a lot of questions about how this was put through. I even spoke with you this morning and said, what sort of engineering has been done? And you said, well, you can FOIL it.
And that is consistent with my memo back in January. And again, I did send you information back in July about this.
Nothing of substance. Sorry.
But for you to say that we weren't being upfront with you when you requested information.
No, I didn't say upfront. I said you haven't been terribly communicative about our specific points. A general memo saying, please keep, you know, I've reached out to the building department and the engineer. We haven't heard anything. All of a sudden, somebody heard something.
And in July, I forwarded you the information I had provided to our engineer based on the application that was submitted.
But nothing came back. Somewhere between July and now, Dan, something came back and the permits were issued.
But is it my response?
I'm not saying you, maybe it's somebody in the building department, but Charlie Magnotta has been calling monthly and being told nothing's happening, we know nothing. He called yesterday and Kathy Guarnola told him, oh yeah, the permit's been issued.
I never spoke with Mr. Magnotta. I know I think I may have emailed him once or twice.
Dan, you're not the only person though in the building department. He was speaking with the building department regularly.
But again, I sent you information on July 29th. You know, there was that the application was in process. So
application's been in process since December.
The first application was to the BAR, which is in December. Then I think which you knew, because that prompted the original letter from.
I'm aware of it, and we had questions for the BAR at that point, and we had objections to the way the house was being designed in a flood zone, and we were told too late, it's passed.
Okay. But I take a little issue with you saying that we haven't been communicative.
Yeah, Dan, you're talking in circles and you're saying the exact same sentence over and over again. Let's get past that. What can be done? This project, we'd like to know, what is the base flood elevation? Is the house 2 feet over the base flood elevation? We still don't know if a HEC-RAS was required. You said, well, not explicitly stated as a HEC-RAS study is required. This would likely be the underpinning of any report prepared and submitted by a licensed engineer. Were all of these things submitted? Were they reviewed? Who reviewed them? Did our floodplain administrator consultant review any of this?
So everything was reviewed by our engineering consultant, Mr. Hildebrand from Callard Sessions. There's
And
several
so the only way that a flood committee can get any kind of information, or we have to now
Does the
foil
flood
as if
committee-
we're just individual
Does the flood committee expect to be copied on every single piece of document? For
In
every
the flood
single
committee,
project?
we've discussed this project in the flood committee. Therefore, shouldn't we be entitled to know what was happening and how these determinations were made? Because you know what? Things have fallen through the cracks over the years. And what we're trying to do is prevent that from happening again.
Okay, I understand that, but if the flood committee is expecting to be copied on every controversial project or every single project in the floodplain, I mean, we couldn't get any work done.
Then what's the point of our committee?
Is the purpose of the committee to audit, building permit applications?
We need some sort of security that this is being done correctly.
Okay,
Just
but
being told, well, it's okay, we issued the permit, therefore it was done correctly, that's not any kind of a check.
okay, but what I'm trying to ascertain is what are the expectations that you have for these reviews?
I'm not certain. That's why Kelly and I had this discussion 2 weeks ago. What is it that this committee does, and how is it that this committee can help be sure that projects are properly built in the floodplain? We've had concerns about how Brixmore was built. Paul, you can certainly speak to that. How does this committee best work with a building department or a planning board? What is the point of having a flood committee if it has no involvement in building in a flood zone?
If we're just going to be a paper tiger, what the hell's the use? And that's what we feel we are. Whoever it is doesn't listen to us. They don't act on what we're bringing to their attention. And all we get is yada, yada, foil, and, that just doesn't work.
In terms of foil, I suggested foil because I didn't want to treat this application any different than I would treat any other application. If someone wanted information on any application, we would ask them to foil us for it. So that's why I suggested.
If a member of the community or anyone writes you a detailed letter asking for specific information, it seems a little
I think
disingenuous to say, well, you'll have to foil for it if you want to find out what we've done.
Well,
we're an arm of village government. We're not, a private citizen sitting out somewhere else. But we're not even given the courtesy. Foil? Are you kidding me?
The January letter, I was trying to be responsive to them. I wouldn't promise to give them documents differently than I would do it for any other resident.
But this committee then got involved. This committee was copied on that letter. So this committee is now part of this discussion.
And it was brought up in July on your July agenda, at which time I followed up and showed you the communication we had on the application to date.
But something happened between July and the 22nd of September or the 21st of September.
The application went through the process.
The application was granted. The permission was granted to build.
Yeah, but it goes through a process and ultimately it was approved.
And is this committee not entitled to know what that process is?
In terms of the administrative steps that we go through? What do you mean by the process?
Dan, we sent a letter. The committee has been involved in it. We don't know what the base flood elevation is. We don't know you're building 2 feet over it. We don't know about the HEC-RAS study. We don't know. The trees all of a sudden got pulled out. It's like anything can happen in this village and no one's responsible. Okay, we can go to a tree committee meeting.
I don't think
trees out of a flood zone. Who's thinking?
I don't recall.
There are questions about,
Was a question raised in the December letter about what the existing base flood elevation was?
absolutely,
Okay, because I can't recall.
absolutely. And then there was a question about, here's another question. When a former occupant of 1602 Ellis investigated building on this property a number of years ago, he was told he would need to put in a fire hydrant and enlarge the size of the water main to accommodate the hydrant. Is this still the policy? And you responded, I have reviewed this with the applicable staff. We will consult with WJWW on any matter related to ensuring proper water pressure for fire suppression. We will reach out to WJWW in the coming days. That was in January.
Okay. So I can follow up on that.
And I have been told that one of the fire marshals was questioning how this could be built because certain equipment couldn't get down that substandard road.
I don't know that to be the case. I don't know who said that.
Andrew LaRocca said it, who is a fire marshal. So he was
he's not a fire
concerned,
marshal.
and he's bringing that up in a meeting tomorrow night. And that will further be pursued, I assume, by the fire department.
He's a firefighter, not a fire marshal.
Well, he's a fire, no, he has another title. Might not be fire marshal, but he's more than a firefighter.
He may have a role
There's
within the
another
fire department.
title.
Yeah, we don't have fire marshals.
Well, I'm sorry, that's my mistake for using the wrong term, Dan. But he is more than just a firefighter, and he has some sort of
Yeah, some additional roles and
investigatory,
Yeah, and he has some additional roles and responsibilities. I don't know what they are, but yeah.
and they're investigatory
Yeah.
for building. It just seems like things get shoehorned through, and not all questions seem to get answered.
Okay, I can certainly follow up on unanswered questions.
Seems to me that there should be different procedures put in place that allows a committee like ours to get some attention and not be treated just like a bunch of 5 separate citizens. We're not getting that. That's the whole point, Dan. I'm not blaming you personally. I'm blaming the system. And the system is failing.
When has this come up before on a single family home residential project?
I don't know.
This is the first one we were made aware of, but does it matter if it hadn't happened before? It's happening now. And this is about you and me, Dan. This is about, as Paul said, process or lack of therein.
No, but I wouldn't classify this one project as endemic of a larger issue.
There were questions about Brixmore raised by this committee.
I'm talking in terms of single family homes.
No. Everything, Dan. I don't care whether it's a high rise or, Brixmore, a private home.
I understand.
They're all in the flood zone.
Yeah, but and those other projects go through a land use process. A single family home typically does not go through a land use process.
But the results could be the same. And that's the problem.
You get enough single family homes that don't go through the process, it's the same as a high rise.
Well, that's something the flood committee can consider. I mean, this is exactly assisting the village of Mamaroneck in identifying potential solutions to flooding. So if the flood committee would like to, identify potential solutions and advise the board about what's going wrong in our land use process, you're invited to do that. I think it's a perfectly legitimate exercise.
But we don't always know what's going on, Kelly. Because we find out about things through word of mouth. There's no formal.
That's what I think Dan is trying to say. There's a difference between auditing at a micro level what's going on with the village consulting and engineer and the building department and those areas, and then saying on a more macro level, we as a flood committee are concerned about this type of building in the floodplain. And so for example, I throw out, we're concerned that single family homes don't go through the planning board where these issues might be more fully fleshed out. we would like to recommend that single family homes go through the planning board. I mean, that's the type of thing I think falls within the parameters of the flood committee and would be a valid exercise, but that's up to you as a committee.
I think differently, and I'm going to disagree.
Okay.
I think that this committee should be consulted when anything is going to be developed in a flood zone, so we can formulate questions on a timely basis that can be brought up and dealt with on a timely basis, and not to find out that, oh, the permit's been issued. Am I wrong?
Does HCZM get the application forms for single family homes?
Not that I'm aware of. I mean,
I think it depends. I
saying-
think some of them, it weighs in on certain aspects of single family home construction. It has
it
to
could
fall.
depend on
Yeah.
the level of detail of the project. But, you know, a simple single family home that's zoning compliant, you know, it's a type 2 action. That's not going to typically go to an HCZM.
But how can you have a simple single-family home that's in a floodway, that's in a flood zone, that has a second river going through it every time there's a storm? This is not a normal single-family project, and that's my point.
So if it complies with zoning, complies with our floodplain development requirements, it's not. It still needs some additional level of review.
Yes.
Okay.
I think we should decide that, don't you? Just like HCCM would have to decide on something along the coast or along one of the rivers. If it goes to them, it should come to us. And we can always say, no, that doesn't apply. That's the job of the chair. But we should be consulted on whether or not this does apply. Can't expect the building inspector to know.
So you can't expect the building inspector to know what?
About the number of trees on the property and whether it's in a floodplain or not? If he does know, then damn it, he should do something about it, not rubber stamp it. You can't support him on that.
I come from a very, by the book review of this. If the zoning code, if it complies with zoning, complies with all applicable laws, I don't know what options we have. But I think, what Kelly, mentioned is if, this is something of concern to the committee, make your concerns noted to the village board in terms of your mission statement.
Okay. Next, Peggy.
Since
That's
the
all I had.
last meeting, Peggy,
I'm sorry?
it's Robert.
Yeah, I know.
Since the last meeting, there were some emails going back and forth in reference to Brickscore.
Mm-hmm.
I thought there would be some discussion about that or more participation. That's an example of something that we could have looked into. I'm not sure why that didn't come up today.
I think based on the emails that went on subsequently, Robert, those questions were not specific to this committee that were raised. I think
Okay.
we've had other, and they should be forwarded to the building department, because if I remember correctly, they had to do with Con Ed, and I think that was out of our jurisdiction.
You're talking about the substation or the transformer and the bollards.
Transformer.
Yeah.
But I think
Improper height.
we've all had concerns about how the project was designed and why it wasn't developed over the base flood elevation the way that Maple and Rose was. That building, I'm sorry, I don't know the name of the building.
I was called the Fiat site.
Exactly, but the bottom line is there was always a kind of concern on our I think as a committee, why was one project built above the base flood elevation and the other one not forced to? That never made sense to us, but it was a done deal. And
Well,
we certainly never asked about it. And
Well, I
shouldn't
think
that be
that's-
something that should be discussed with a committee like ours?
Well, in terms of the planning process, or that was, the planning board level. I think we did discuss whether or not need to be built above the base flood elevation. And what we discussed, I think you were gonna communicate to the board, is for commercial properties, it's not required to be built 2 feet above.
We had suggested, and we sent a letter, I don't know where that went to, that we had recommended that all building be done over 2 feet over the base flood elevation in a flood zone.
Yeah, no, that's my recollection of the discussion, so.
Right, but that's behind, that's after, that's cleaning up after the elephant.
Yeah.
I'd like to see us be able to get ahead of the elephant.
Well, if you submitted a letter to the village board with that request, I can't promise what the board would do, but you have made your thoughts and recommendations known to the village board at this point. You can certainly, ask again, reinforce the request, but I can't force 5 people to, and I wouldn't want to. No, but I say I can't. If you put your request in the board, that's all you can. That's what you've done already. What they do with the request is the board's prerogative, but you can certainly, make sure your request, resubmitted or asked to, talk with them about it.
Okay,
I mean, absolutely. Whenever you want to come before the board,
I think
let me
that's
know.
one thing to do.
Something,
Yeah.
but I would just suggest that as a committee, there be some, consensus, of here's what we as a committee, majority of the committee.
Well,
want to do.
we had discussed this at length, and I think the committee had agreed, and correct me if I'm wrong, ladies and gentlemen of the committee, but we had said that we felt it was important that any new construction in the commercial zone, in the flood zone, be required to be built 2 feet over the base flood elevation. Does
I think
anybody?
we said we can't do anything about Brixmore, but we can use that as a horrid example of what has been done and what shouldn't be done in the future. So we have to have it in writing, Peggy.
Dane, we did.
I know, I mean,
Robert,
it
Dana,
has to be
agree
policy
to
by
that?
the village board. The village board has to make it policy, and it has to be written for,
Into our code.
yeah, it's got to be part of the code.
That's what we'd suggested.
Otherwise, we're
Maria
just,
and Robert and Dana, do you agree? Because none of you have chimed in on this one.
I agree with what you and Paul have just said.
I do as well.
I think it makes sense.
Okay. So do we need to formally resubmit that?
I think what you should do is put it in writing, what you would like in writing, and appear before the board and talk about it so that you can answer questions that other board members may have. Jerry may have some questions. The attorney may have some questions. I just think it's good to have someone there to really spell out exactly what you're asking for.
Okay.
sounds good.
Well, should we get on the Tuesday calendar?
It's too late, I believe, for that. Dan?
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
pretty much done with
Can
the
you-
agenda and.
Email us the next slot available, and we could maybe get on in the beginning of a meeting and make a quick
Work session.
presentation.
Yeah, I think the next meeting is
The 13th.
the 13th and then the 26th of October.
13th of October?
Yep.
And you got the
I
26th.
think I have an LMC board meeting. Hold on. I have an LMC board meeting. I cannot be there. Could we do it at a work session prior?
Well, the work session prior is the one next Tuesday. The 26th is the next work session after that.
I can't be there, but if other members of the committee would like to go, that's fine with me.
Well, let's talk about it, Peggy. I mean, you should be there.
Okay.
Yes.
So does that make it the 27th of October?
The 26th.
26th. Can we get on that calendar, Dan?
Yeah, just send the letter and ask to be put on the work session agenda for the 26th.
The work session is what, 5 o'clock?
5 o'clock.
Uh,
Yep.
5 o'clock. Yeah, and just if you want to copy me on whatever you send, so it'll put it in my mind to create the item.
I'll copy you and I'll copy Kelly.
Okay.
How's that?
Yep.
Okay.
Peggy, did you want to talk about the minutes now or?
In one sec,
at a
Robert.
time?
I want to go back 1 sec. I still feel that that's going to cover the commercial piece of it. It's certainly not going to cover the residential piece.
No, we should ask for both.
Well,
There shouldn't be any difference.
No, the residential.
No, there is.
The residential
Has to be
2
built.
feet above. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about that. The commercial is either 2 feet above or at grade and floodproof.
At grade, right, for commercial, but residential has to be 2 feet over the BFE.
Correct. So there's no ifs, ands, or buts there.
Which is why I questioned what the BFE was and were they building 2 feet over on Ellis. And I still maintain that, and we had discussed this, I will bring it up one more time. The way the house was designed, if you're facing the property, the river is on the right side, and they were putting the garage on the left side and the family room on the river side, which didn't make a lot of sense to me. Now, the Architectural Review Board, it was discussed there because my neighbor went to that Architectural Review Board meeting and brought this up, but they passed it anyway. It still seems counterintuitive when you can put non-habitable space in towards the floodway and leave the habitable space on the opposite side.
No, I think that's a judgment call, Peggy. You know, by the board or commission.
By the board of Architectural Board of Review.
I don't think it makes sense, but that's their prerogative.
Except I don't know that they necessarily understand what a floodway is and what they're not dealing with this all the time. They don't have that level of expertise. I just think that this process in general is a little counterintuitive.
All right.
And I'd like anybody's help to try and figure out how we can do this better, because I certainly don't know.
Think about it.
All right, let's put it on the agenda for next month then. Yes, Robert, let's talk about the minutes.
Well, I'm sorry, before you do that,
Yeah,
if you're going to discuss this again at next month's meeting, when you go before the board, do you want to have like a more comprehensive, do you want to include the residential in that discussion, or do you want to just go and deal with the commercial piece?
let's deal with the commercial first,
Okay, that's
because
fine.
we've got that.
Okay.
I think that makes better
I
sense.
guess with the residential, what would you propose aside from the current 2 feet, the only allowed? 2
And
feet?
I'm saying process. I'm just not sure that,
Oh, okay. I thought you were talking about the floodplain development law. Sorry.
I don't think it makes sense to stick a house where it's being stuck in the manner it's being stuck in at all. And it seems to me that this committee knows more about flooding than other committees will, and will have different questions about building in a flood zone than other committees might. And we have no voice in the process.
Well, you know, unless it affects a neighboring property, it's probably none of our business. You know, it's not like a commercial property. where what you're doing affects everybody around you.
Either it makes sense to build it in a certain manner in a flood zone, or it doesn't.
Well,
I don't
no,
think it
then you
should be
got the
commercial.
rights of the personal property owner. They've got rights too to build something stupid if they want.
That just seems crazy to me. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
That is it. Then we might as well give up, because there's no point for this committee to exist.
Well, if we can get commercial, that's a start.
I have to say, Peggy, I strongly disagree with you. I don't think we're a land use board. I think that, if you want to make recommendations, that's a great thing. But I think there's a lot for this committee to do that can benefit the community, that doesn't have to do with telling homeowners how they can build their houses. I think, the fact that there's nothing up on the website about hurricane preparedness, that's just, there should be something. The committee can work on that. I think, hosting public meetings on flooding and flood mitigation, I think that would be a great thing to do in this community that happens to suffer from a lot of flooding. But
Kelly, we've done them over the years, honestly. And at the end of the day, the answer of how to solve problems in the flood zone in this committee is the Army Corps of Engineers, and there's not enough money to resolve our problems.
But I don't think you just throw up your arms and say, there's nothing for this committee to do. I think there's a lot for this committee to do.
Then, you know what, maybe I should have a different chair, because I don't understand where else we can take this. And I'm feeling incredibly, excruciatingly frustrated.
I know.
What went on? We brought this up as a committee. I brought this up to the committee since December. And I don't feel that anything has happened that's been positive. And to say, well, if people want to develop stupidly for residential property, okay, let's let them do it. I just think that's counterproductive. I'm sorry. I'm not expecting us to be a land use board. I know we're not a land use board. And that's a little insulting for you to say that. I know the difference.
My apologies.
But I do think we should have some sort of a say in what gets developed in a flood zone, or to make recommendations on a timely basis to the people who are making those decisions.
Peggy, I think we ought to take one battle at a time. Let's get the commercial done. Let's get, something about the, trees in a floodway. We're asking for an awful lot at the same time.
But if we don't start thinking of this problem, it's going to be another 13 years and nothing's going to change.
Well, one battle at a time, Peggy.
So we'll resubmit this letter. The letter is done, Paul. That's done. We simply have to take it to the board. In terms of residential, if we don't start considering how this committee can have impact, then we're never going to get to a point where we can have helpful impact. And that's my frustration.
Well, we can submit it along with a commercial to the board, but
Submit what?
my stress would be on commercial and industrial right now. And the individual, I don't know,
Either we handle building in our community in a flood zone and a floodway to the best possible building practices and the most efficient systems, or we don't. I'm simply saying, if we don't start thinking about what we can suggest this committee does to start moving this process in maybe a better direction, then we're never going to get anywhere.
Oh, I think we will. But let's take it one step at a time. Let's see how we do with the commercial. And we can also mention residential and see what the experts, the attorneys and everybody had to say about individual rights versus community rights.
I don't
You
agree.
know,
with Paul.
I see.
Maybe Paul, you and I will agree to disagree.
No, I see your thing about the trees on residential property. That I agree with completely. But then you segue into where the driveway and where the living quarters should be.
Paul,
I
if you
wanna-
understood this particular site and you walked the site, you would understand the concerns. Because what happens before the riverbank is overflowed by the river jumps the wall and creates a second river, which goes right down where this proposed house is going to go, and then floods all of the houses on Chestnut before the water ever comes over the wall.
All right.
So now we're sticking a house in the middle of that.
Well, then you're really saying that that property is unusable.
I can't say that.
But that's what you're saying.
I'm saying that we should be, every committee that's got a voice in this, and maybe there aren't any committees in residential and that's the problem. Maybe Kelly's point is right. Maybe single family homes should go through planning, because too many of these hiccups aren't being caught. ARB doesn't know what the floodway is. Why would they? I didn't know about a floodway until I raised my house.
Well,
I just think there's got to be a way this committee can interface to make our other committees stronger and make better decisions.
well, let's ask the board when we're in front of them. My battery's about to give out on my iPad, so I may get cut off at any
Agreeing
time.
with that?
Pardon?
I asked if Kelly is disagreeing with that,
Oh.
and she's sighing.
No, I'm tired. Peggy, I know you have strong views on this. I think what I have heard tonight is a consensus of the board of the Flood Mitigation Committee that you would like to go to the board with a recommendation on commercial building in the village. We have discussed putting that on the schedule for the 26th. I am hearing not consensus among the Flood Mitigation Committee members about what should be done about residential.
Well, that's why I don't want to go to the board on the 26th with that. We
Right.
need to have a consensus.
And I think those are discussions that the Flood Committee should continue having. But I'm not a member of the committee. So
That's
you know,
why I had said earlier, we should put this on the agenda for next month and everybody think about it.
Yep. I agree.
Okay.
Okay? Robert,
Yes.
minutes. Didn't
Well-
forget.
My term expires at the end of this year. I was talking to Peggy about somebody may want to consider taking over the minutes. And should we have a discussion about the content of the minutes, maybe revising the format? Perhaps Peggy pointed out that the minutes, the draft of the minutes should go to the members significantly prior to the next each meeting, which I have not done. And whether members would want an opportunity to insert comments or suggestions of their own in the minutes, or should we continue doing what we're doing now, which is not doing a lot of editing of recorded minutes.
Well, my biggest concern is that if we do the minutes right before the next meeting, we forget what we had done. The minutes should be done pretty much when they're fresh after the meeting, I think, in everyone's
Right.
mind, or whoever's writing them's mind, and then sent out for review so that everybody remembers what we had just discussed. So they should be done, I don't know, a week or so. Maybe we could make an agreement to do that. Whoever's doing them, do them maybe a week or so within a meeting time.
All right, so I will do that for the rest of the term that I have.
And then
going
we
forward, you
adopt
can
that.
Have someone else do that as well.
Robert, I think your minutes are fabulous. I think your format's great.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I don't have new business and old business. You know, there are different formats people use for,
I think your minutes are fabulous.
okay, thank you.
Very detailed. Far better than when I used to do them.
Agreed.
Thank you.
Do you still have that funky notebook?
Sorry?
You still have that funky notebook with the,
Which one?
you have like with the hardcover and the, okay,
This one?
yes.
Of course. All right, with that, I think we should adjourn the meeting and we can talk about who would like to do it. Dana, Maria, maybe one of the two of you would like to take a go of it, or we'll see who else joins the committee. Andrew Spatz has mentioned to me he would like to rejoin the committee when his year is up, so.
Who was that?
Andrew Spatz.
Okay.
Okay.
Peggy, we can also clean up. I checked. Nerese, Nerese is on the committee. She has not been here, I don't believe, ever since I've been coming.
She was
She
here
came
once.
to one meeting.
Her term also expires in December, but if you want to clear it out before then, you know, you can write a letter. Do you remember I sent you emails?
But I have done that, and Jerry said he would take her off the committee when he first started joining our meetings.
Okay.
But you know, at this point, whether she's on or not, I don't know that it's.
But we have one opening as it is.
Correct, and we're going to have Robert's off in December, so we'll have two.
I was just looking up. Robert and Nerese are up in December.
Right.
So they're the only two.
Right.
Robert, I don't know how long you've been on and if you're eligible to up for a
6
second.
years.
But it's up
And
to
he's
you.
done his 6-year term.
Okay, then I'm sorry.
But he'll come back again, and what we all do is we take a year off and then we come back.
Yeah, I can see Paul, founding member, still kicking around.
I don't know, was it voluntary, Paul? Did we drag, or were you?
I don't know. There's a little, you know,
You didn't pull a Lyndon
little
Johnson?
coercion there, I think.
Well, Robert, you'll have to come back then.
Okay.
Okay.
I've enjoyed my time. It's been very entertaining and certainly very informative.
Well, we
I
love
remember
having you.
when this first came up and I realized I knew nothing about flooding, but I thought it was such an interesting, important topic that I said, well, let's dig in and find out more about it, see what we can do.
Well, the great news is the Army Corps could still be around.
That was
certainly
really
was
surprising. It's happily
Yeah.
surprising.
Okay, shall we adjourn?
Sure.
Yes.
Thank you all.
So moved.
I have
Bye-bye.
one question. Maria, are you on
Yes.
vacation?
Am I? No.
Where the hell are you? What is
prior-
that?
It's a background. Prior to the beginning of the meeting, I asked Dan how he got that wonderful Village of Mamaroneck background, and he told us how to do it. So now nobody gets to see my dirty house. You could
Oh,
think I'm vacationing somewhere wonderful.
Robert, my cat is trying to figure out how to jump up. Here he comes.
Bye-bye.
Do you see him, Robert?
Oh, there he
I
is.
don't. Is it an orange cat like mine?
No, he's a black.
I see him. Oh my God, beautiful,
Little dumb.
beautiful.
So say hello to your
Good
cat.
night, everybody.
All right, good night all. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Good night.